Hello, welcome back. I want to make two videos today. As I said in the other videos, or one video, I'm struggling with books, so I want to get through some books before I move. Not too many in these two today. I think I might do something on more on Russian poetry and maybe some romantic poets if I can get around to it. Actually, today is not on on literature or whatever. Well, it will get into literature, but the main thing is to get some conspiracy talk into the videos. I've mentioned some of that before. Obviously, my lockdown video included some theories beyond the mainstream, which is not difficult to delve into these days. There's so much stuff around. And I've also mentioned in the politics, information, emancipation video, some of that stuff as well. Particularly about like the increase of information, basically. So I'm just going to give you my view on the conspiracy alternate research environment, really, as I see it. And again, I'll kind of give you a breakdown over the years and kind of give you a personal take on it. Have we got enough light? Well, try for as best we can. It's very miserable. It's classic British weather outside. Yeah, so conspiracy. I started in my, I think it was in my poetic growth video, talking about some of the books that I read when I was in my mid to late teens. And I think this is kind of useful because although I wasn't explicitly ushered into kind of realms of alternate theory and conspiracy until much later, I think I always had a mind for that because, I mean, just experience itself seems to indicate something other that's not talked about. I always felt that when I was, I think not as a child, because a child immediately you're kind of aware. I would say you have all the other realms, the spiritual realms available to you, at least you did do in my upbringing. I wonder what vaccines are doing in relation to that these days. But ostensibly you've got the world of childhood, and it's the world of, because I think kind of in terms of poetry a lot of the time, so it's very much Dylan Thomas, a world of wonder, a world of magic, which actually doesn't go away. The only difference is that your perception changes with education, and you're pretty much brainwashed into not seeing all this stuff. I name-checked William Blake very early on in my videos, so the assumption there is if you've touched on Blake or if you've read any Blake, that the guy saw angels, right? So my presumption is that if you're watching this, you're watching somebody who's willing to deal with the spiritual realm and talk about it, and we'll get into it in other videos. One thing should be mentioned is that Huxley, I mentioned in the other video, is an interesting one. I read all the dystopian books when I was fairly younger. And if we are in a basically controlled environment in terms of information, or a semi-controlled environment, we definitely were prior to the video channels, amping up, say, in the mid to late noughties, I would say. But without that, we've got, books. We have the usual resources. A good conspiracy angle straight away, if you want to refer to that video on poetic growth and poetic initiation, is that it was very important that those books came out early and that I was encouraged to read William Blake and Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Now, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, ostensibly, if you've not researched this already, um, that was something I got into, and already it gives you a conspiracy angle. So those two books that were recommended to me, I remember, along with a handful. I've talked about that all in the other video. Um, yes, it's very strange. There's a scene in Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas where he's on acid and he sees a bunch of lizards in a hotel bar. And if those who haven't read the book, you will have seen the movie. They recreate it. Terry Gilliam recreates the thing, and you don't really make much of it when you first read the book. But there are nuances there that are interesting. For example, I was later to study more into Hunter S. Thompson, study Hunter S. Thompson's death, which was very suspicious. Apparently, he typed out a short suicide note and then killed himself with a revolver, if I remember rightly. And then he said in his in that note or in his papers that he wanted to be fired from a rocket into space. And you had this very fantastical ceremony, apparently, with Johnny Depp there and a bunch of celebs firing Hunter's ashes into space, which is pretty bizarre. It just so happened that I think even prior to Hunter S. Thompson's death, I'd already studied a lot things of the ilk of Ted Gunderson, the kind of FBI agent who had spilled the beans on the deep state, as Trump likes to call it these days. Back then, it was just a random conspiracy theory that I caught on to it in 2010. I'm just giving you context for this Hunter S. Thompson thing because it connects with my learning, my book learning, well previous to knowing anything conspiratorial, really. Hunter S. Thompson was involved in some form of initiation, and he had to make snuff films for what we would loosely call the Illuminati. That would be back in the 70s and 80s, and we have evidence from a Johnny Ghosh at the time, who was a kidnapped child, or a child who was being used in covert sacrifices and things of that nature. So we know that there's some dodgy stuff there going on with Hunter S. Thompson, and of course it's become really well known the last year, even that recently. The whole adrenochrome angle has everyone's kind of talking about that, and of course adrenochrome as well is in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. So it's a book that can be read on lots of different levels. By no means is it just a zany journalist episode from the early 70s, as perhaps the beat writers or the baby boomers would like to make it out to be. So I think in that sense it's interesting, although I obviously wasn't reading it on that level at the time. The reptilian lizard thing would connect with David Icke, one of his wilder theories, which most people who are into alternate research will still shun. I'll get into that a little bit later, but that's my reason for mentioning Hunter S. Thompson early, because you can actually read these things retrospectively, and I do believe in synchronicity, and I do believe in a build-up of information over time. So you're not going to get everything initially. You might even be involved in activities like reading certain books, and you don't really know why you're reading them until you see a more nuanced view on the thing. And I find the same thing happens with poetry all the time. That you'll be typing out a poem, or you'll be writing a poem and looking and going, what is this? And you might even get frustrated with yourself, and you get the usual problem of the day later or a couple of days later, you look at it and you go, that is just what, you either don't make head and a tail of it, or you may even just overtly not like it, react negatively to it. And I think that this is what I'm going to call bardism, or kind of not urban shamanism, but there's definitely kind of a quotidian shamanism that's happening during the course of your life, particularly if you are kind of a seeker after things. I didn't explicitly to myself even think that I was like that, but I do think getting those two books early was interesting. I personally think Hunter S. Thompson was probably killed for what he knew, and he probably tried to get out of the Illuminati or sever connections with certain people, and he couldn't do. And I don't buy the suicide story. And of course, Johnny Depp since then has become a rather suspect character, particularly on the adrenochrome angle. This is my newest copy of William Blake. I have a few copies, but I'm most attached to this one from the 60s. It was first printed in the 40s. I haven't actually looked at Blake very specifically in the last couple of years. I've been focused on other things. I no longer have the book that I referred to in that video, but I have a bunch of other different editions. And I'm going to stick with that angle, the romantic poetry angle, as we can see conspiracy as a kind of gauze for us to look at conspiracy theory. I'll give you some extra background though. I also was reading D.H. Lawrence quite young as well. And I think I pretty much knew there was something suspect fairly early from just intuition. What we're encouraged to deal with is the rational and the logical. And it was never really my mindset. It wasn't my approach to life. And I read Blake early as well, and that helped. And I'm going to mention some authors and writers from the past because as much as people study conspiracy theory and they get interested in it, or they get locked into certain theories and not others, and they hope a lot of the problem with the alternate research now is there's so much that you can get into very anxious arguments about one theory or another. Over the next year or two, if I keep making videos, I'll mention the ones that specifically mean something to me, and ones that I just keep, half an eye on. I don't really focus on. With the advent of all this information that I mentioned in that politics, what was it? Politics, information, emancipation. With the advent of that, information sprawl, you can get quite lost in conspiracy. So it's kind of important to keep your balance. I mean, this has been said by other people making videos on a similar topic, so it's not really worth going into. But I would say, like, for a good decade now, I've been looking into this stuff. And I think the problem, of course, is that you're going to want to spread the news, particularly if you have access to social media, and most people do. And that's something I had to learn the hard way, because the first few years there's not that many takers, and you've got to wait for people to develop as well. But just to go back, I had those two books, and there were certain other books in my life that may have led into a conspiratorial view of the world. But I think just from intuition, I knew something was dead wrong. For example, it seemed to me that most people were thick, not ignorant, not horrible. They treat you well. But the seeking of the truth was not something uppermost in their mind. It seemed to me as a teenager, their main focus, and perhaps some of this is admirable, was hopefully having a job, having a couple of kids, and all that being said, they didn't mind the fact that there were massive gaps in their knowledge about the world. As a poet, as I went on, what I wanted to do was widen my awareness as much as I could. So the other thing you find with people, and I've mentioned this before, I think, is that their awareness kind of expands to a certain degree through higher education. I can't speak for now. I'm only speaking of the people in the 90s. It may well be that it just explicitly shuts you down now. I've no idea. I've not had access to any form of education as a student since 2007. So I couldn't, give you a good picture. I would assume that it's only gotten worse and worse from the talk outside of the institutions. Again, whose fault is that? It's a systemic problem. There's some people saying it's just all brainwashing now. I would vaguely follow that line of thinking, perhaps unbeknownst to itself. Same goes for the health service. But I did always feel that there was just massive gaps in people's awareness, and also that goes in tandem with the fact that people ostensibly didn't want to learn. So there was a twofold. In a certain sense, there was a resignation, even with alternate knowledge, even back in my 20s. It was pretty obvious fairly soon that those two things were going in tandem. So people didn't know anything, didn't want to know anything. Whether they were at university or not didn't really make any difference. They were at university so that they could get some work, hopefully, at the end of it. Or maybe they could get some independence from their family and try to gain as little information beyond what they knew of the world before that. I just realised I've still got these headphones on. I don't need these. So that was my kind of feeling through my late teens and early 20s. Like I said in the other video, I started writing when I was very young. So what would be my models beyond what I've already mentioned? Like Ted Hughes's Crow would come up, or The Wasteland and the Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot. Things that were fairly big on the horizon of people who wanted to write poetry at that time. I never really much liked The Wasteland. I liked the Four Quartets better, and I was vocal about that at the time. What else? I'm trying to keep this more on the conspiratorial angle. I think Blake is a good kind of entrance for conspiracy, to be quite frank. I mean, if you read The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, it seems to me that with further readings, I've lived with the complete poems for 25 years at least now. He's a guy that sees spirits, talks to disembodied beings. When he had printing issues, he was trying to print illuminated books. His brother had died, and he, in the spirit world, he got some advice from his brother about how to print his books. So this is this is a guy immersed in different forms of clairvoyance, dream informancy, this kind of thing. So regardless of what I learned in terms of literature later, it always had a Blakean colouring on it. And I always went back to Blake more than, the majority of the writers that I read later on. I also got into a lot of other writers. Through Blake, you would learn about Dante Gabriel Rossetti. These are people who rescued manuscripts and stuff like that, early biographies. All of that helps you out. I'm going to stick with the romantic poetry angle on conspiracy for a while, and I want to dig into something that happened to me fairly recently. I think there's always been a sense of this conspiratorial view, I think, particularly with the loss of the Freemasons to the Illuminati. I do believe that there was some benign form of Freemasonry, ostensibly benign for quite a while, but I think there was a takeover possibly around Blake's time, actually, the 18th century. And, you get Weishaupt is the main name that comes up in connection to this. So I don't think Freemason was ostensibly bad, and of course you've got people like Manly P. Hall. But I thought that I would put this little snippet of information in early because you can look at the conspiracy stuff from so many different angles, and it's already been talked about so much, on places like YouTube, that I don't really want to be repeating information. Um, so what I'm going to try is throw in a few different examples that I believe support conspiracy, and this is one of them. I was actually on the west coast of Ireland fairly recently. This only happened to me last year. And this is, I would say this is an example of synchronicity. It's very interesting. Um, I needed the toilet and I went into a pub, and on the bookshelf of the pub, pubs, sometimes they have old books sat there. Um, and this one is very old actually. It was this book, which I have now commandeered for my own uses. Terrible person that I am. You can't see the title. It's Autobiographical Sketches by Thomas de Quincey. I was just sat there in this pub, downstairs in this pub. Bunch of old books. You see them all the time, don't you? In fact, if anything, if I want to try to absolve myself of this despicable crime, I will add books to random pub bookshelves now and again. You never know. Why not? I kind of like these little gestures. I went through looking for the quote in here that immediately struck me, and it struck me within, where are we? We're only within 50 pages of the beginning of the book. I actually haven't completed reading this book, but I just found this one piece of information that fascinated me. If you know Thomas de Quincey, he did Confessions of an Opium Eater. He was from Manchester. Again, that's interesting for me because I'm from near that area. He's a really, really great writer, championed the Lake poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge, all the rest of it. In fact, he was kind of obsessed with Coleridge, with both of them, really. So that's the book. You can get probably paperback versions of this online. I keep notebooks, as I probably already said. Let's have a look at the conspiracy angle from Thomas de Quincey's viewpoint. So what I was reading in Autobiographical Sketches that struck me is that Thomas de Quincey, the first half of that book is really focused on his childhood, living in a place called Greenhay near Manchester. I haven't looked it up on the map. I don't know where it is in relation to the centre of Manchester. And he starts talking about his brother, and his brother died when he was fairly young, but he talks about fairly early conversations he had with his brother, and ostensibly from a 21st century perspective, his brother was a conspiracy theorist. Do souls come and go from this world rather fast when they have too much knowledge for the environment? I wonder. Anyway, his brother died quite young. I can't give you many of the details because it's been a good few months since I've actually read that book. I'm just going to read you the quote that I found, plus a footnote that interested me. There are a few related quotes, in fact, all from that book, which I think I might read as well, just to give you context. A British surgeon, indeed, in a work of 2 octavo volumes, has endeavoured to show that a conspiracy was traced to... Oh, hold on, I can't read my own writing. Waterloo. A conspiracy was traced to Waterloo between 2 or 3 foreign regiments for kindling a panic in the heat of the battle by flight and by a sustained blowing up of tumbrils. I think he's referring to the Battle of Waterloo, and that it's been well talked about in the internet alternate research environment, that the Rothschilds controlled both sides in the Battle of Waterloo. Anyway, this is what De Quincey says. A sustained blowing up of tumbrils under the miserable purpose of shaking the British steadiness, but the evidences are not clear. Whereas my brother insisted that the presence of sham men, distributed extensively among the human race, and meditating treason against us all, had been demonstrated to the satisfaction of all true philosophers. Who were these shams and make-believe men? They were, in fact, people that had been dead for centuries, but that, for reasons best known to themselves, had returned to this upper earth, walked about among us, and were indistinguishable, except by the most learned of necromancers, from authentic men of flesh and blood. I mention this for sake of illustrating the fact, of which the reader will find a singular instance in the footnote attached, that the same crazes are everlastingly revolving upon men. That's from page 42 of Autobiographic Sketches by Thomas de Quincey. I'll read the footnote. 5 years ago, during the Carnival of Universal Anarchy, equally amongst doers and thinkers, a closely printed pamphlet was published with this title: A New Revelation, or the Communion of the Incarnate Dead with the Unconscious Living, Important Fact, without Trifling Fiction, by him. I've actually looked up that pamphlet. We'd be talking, I couldn't find it. We'd be talking, I think De Quincey's writing his sketches in the 1830s or so this would be coming out around the 1830s. Again, it's kind of got that Ickean tinge to it. I have not the pleasure of knowing him, published anonymously, but certainly I must concede to him that he writes like a man of extreme sobriety upon his extravagant theme. He is angry with Swedenborg, as might be expected, for his chimeras, some of which, however, of late years have signally altered their aspect. But as to him, there is no chance that he should be occupied with chimeras, because he has met with some who have acknowledged the fact of their having come from the dead. Habes confitentem recam, I think that's the Latin for having come from the dead. Few, however, are endowed with so much candour, and in particular, for the honest of literature, it grieves me to find, by page 10, that the largest number of these shams, and perhaps the most uncandid, are to be looked for amongst publishers and printers, of whom, it seems, the great majority are most forgeries. A few speak frankly about the matter, and say they don't care who knows it, which, to my thinking, is impudence. But by far the larger section doggedly deny it, and call a policeman if you insist in charging them with being shams. Some differences there are between my brother and him, but in great outline of their views they coincide. And that's his footnote to what his brother was telling him. And like I said, he's writing in, I think it's the 1830s. I find that fascinating, and it's useful perhaps to give you the conspiracy angle through the words of a romantic writer from, like I said, what have we got here? No, this is 60s, 1860s, is it? No, he died 59. I think this was published after he died. Sorry about that. Yeah, so 1860s it's definitely published. He's probably writing that well earlier. He died in 59, so he could be writing in the 30s. But the publishing of the sketches didn't occur until the 60s. So I think that's really interesting, and it's kind of unfortunate that we have this correlation between shaman and sham men. I think that's an accidental thing. Shaman, to my mind, is a much more benign, perhaps even definitely beneficial individual in society, and that's another video as well, shamanism and poetry. So I just found that fascinating from this, old book, which is interesting. It's stamped as from Staffordshire, which is where I studied when I was in my 20s. So I thought that's interesting. I don't know if I wanted to interleave this talk on conspiracy with other things that De Quincey talks about. um, I'll leave it for now because I don't want to get off topic. De Quincey is really interesting, um, and a fellow, well, from my area of the world, let's say. So you've got this existence of sham men, and I think it doesn't strike me as weird coming out of romantic writing and that kind of era of writing, because there is a kind of sense of the spirit which really springs up through Shelley and Blake and some of those writers. Um, and I think it is a kind of a form of, it ends up being a form of cultural combat against, the industrial age in a way. I definitely view the world as a kind of spiritual, mystical realm in some sense that is always in need of balance. So once humanity goes too far in one direction or in one way of thinking, um, you get corrections and adjustments along the way. Obviously, this can get totally out of hand if you take the Soviet Union. But even with the writing that's come out of the 20th century, I'd still suggest some kind of a progression there, between those forms of writing in the major authors, say Yeats, Pound, Lawrence. These are, I would say, influences for the good. So that's like a good way to start this kind of topic, really. Um, so I had indications um, through that and through looking into I always loved the romantic poets from fairly young anyway. Nothing explicit till later, and then of course you reflect through what you know now onto what was there. But De Quincey is a good example, an explicit example of what we'd be talking about. And he looks at it through the framework of printing, because of course that was that was our internet essentially. I mean, that was our form of information. Our main form of information was publishing and printing. And he's saying that these sham men are ostensibly involved in printing and publishing. So that's the kind of thing. That's the kind of influence that you've got, a demonic influence. Shelley delineated this for me quite well, because he has demonic and daemonic. Daemonic is coming from the Greek, so it's actually, to my mind, it's benign in and of itself, but demonic obviously comes much more out of the religious traditions, and that is negative, obviously. So you've got those forms of informancy, spiritual informancy, in some way, connected with what you're doing if you're a creative writer or somebody like that. So I had that. I also had Huxley, which I already mentioned. If we're going to compete dystopias, which is a great practice for some people nowadays, with all of this recent stuff as well, I would say that we are, because I was trying to figure out through my reading of poets of the Soviet Union, for example, that definitely is the Orwellian template, right? If you're going to have a dystopia, particularly somewhere between the 30s and, well, the mid-20s through till the 60s in the Soviet Union, possibly later. I don't know what kinds of persecutions were still going on. Definitely publishing was not going on. To my mind, it's not that dissimilar from now. The only difference is that we have the internet. So, to my mind, as I've already said, we don't have a healthy publishing situation for poets and free-thinking autodidacts. It doesn't exist. We have possibly about 30 to 50 magazines of poetry, most of them funded by the government, and they're just knitting circle situations by people who are generally brainless. So it seems to me that there are certain dystopian elements that are utterly fulfilled by the world we live in. But, as with all things, human energy finds its own forms of expression. So that is your internet. Anyway, Huxley. I think we're in the Huxley thing because I studied the Soviet Union and it looks more like Orwell, right? It's the boot in the face eternally aspect. Now, if you want to control populace, a given populace or many nations, which is, if you take the lockdown as an example, you could at least speculate that that's basically what's happened, even if you weren't interested in conspiracy. But it's definitely not the boot in the face because it's too overt. I mean, you can't have it that overt. I mean, the boot in the face right now is probably a face mask, right? Seems to me that it's technocratic. And if it's technocratic, then it's Huxley. And the thing with Huxley, which is what he always talked about, some people say he was in on it, some people say he just was around these people, what De Quincey calls sham men. Icke calls them reptilians. There's lots of different names. You can even use the Gnostic term archons, right? Yeah, technocracy. It's a big one. And if you read The End of Brave New World, you need to get control of the health service, really. And you've got to have a controlled environment. So you've got to kind of keep the wheels turning. And if you're going to kill anybody, you do it slowly. So you do it with misuse of information. If somebody gets long-term illness which they can't solve, you don't tell them anything, and in telling them nothing, give them the impression that you've given them advice about something. And as long as they're lazy and they don't study their own health issues, then that will perpetuate itself. And if you do need to give them anything, make sure it doesn't help them. Now, all of this stuff will come from the top. I mean, the minions below don't care about it. They've probably got this sense that there's something a little bit up, and if they could make their money in some other way, they probably would. And you have those chats all the time, like trying to do this. This is the great energetic anxiety of our time. People are involved in with institutions and large groups which allow them salaries which they're uncomfortable with, and they're constantly trying to find their own economic independence. Some of them succeed, some of them don't. And that's the great struggle, and the internet is involved with that as well. But it seems to me we've got I call it the comfy chair, right? You've got to have people enjoy their servitude. So it's not the boot in the face, it's the comfy chair. If you've got everything at your doorstep, you don't need to go anywhere, you're entertained perpetually, then it's the comfy chair. So any problems in society won't seem too bad because you're kind of living in this little bubble where everything's provided for you. It's a little bit womb-like. And given the last few months, it seems even more that way, really. So I had the Huxley. I didn't put it all together then. I went to university. I think for a lot of people during the 90s, the big conspiracy or that angle on the world was JFK, right? So, but again, as I've said in other videos, there's not that much information out there, so you're just kind of dependent on paperbacks you pick up about JFK, and they're giving you fairly generic responses to a problem. I think I read one book on JFK which was just, it was the mafia, Sam Giancana or whatever. JFK the movie is good, and it gave you a window onto a world, but you didn't really have any explicit answers for the problem. You knew it was suspect, but you couldn't really. I mean, with the internet now, there's like lots of different theories. In fact, if you want to look up Joseph P. Farrell, he's done some work on it. Lots of people have. So I won't go into that too much. I'm just giving you a sense of my awareness. Since then, The next one will be 9/11, but as I said in the other video, that took a while to figure out there are other versions of what happened. Took me good 5 years to kind of get a really solid alternate view of what had happened, and then now there's like an explosion of well, since then anyway. There's any number of theories out there. I mean, the most recent one is that it was all um, not CGI, but all of the footage was basically constructed, and that there were no planes to begin with. But I'm just giving you the newest theory that I've heard about. I mean, there's been loads. Again, I've not come to any conclusions. I'm the kind of person that listens to this stuff, but if I definitely feel one way or the other on a theory, then I will mention it also. It's just that case I don't feel I need to right now. So we had JFK, and then we had 9/11. I had these things, 9/11, but it's still not kicking in. Like I said, after that, I looked into as a British viewer of political events, the next one would most obviously be for me. The bombings, the London bombings of 2005. And I wrote this pamphlet as a response. It didn't really come out until 2009. It went through different drafts. I was even studying poetry in a university when I was working on this stuff. The first version of the poem was called Midnight in August, and it came out fairly quickly after the event. I think it happened in July 2005, and I had a draft of the poem by the end of August of that year, and then it went through different drafts, and that's the name of it now. It's got the Latin angle. Some of these pamphlets are available if you want copies. Published in 2009. I wasn't that aware of it was just a response that something was up. I couldn't give any alternate narrative, but you know, it's a poem that for somebody who's skeptical of what's going on, you know, it will hopefully do something for you. So that happened in 2005. If you're interested in that event, then there was one video that was very interesting on it. 7/7. I'll put it in the description. I'll find it and put it in the description. There was one video in particular that did a good breakdown of it. The suggestion was in that video that the two guys involved were killed by the police afterwards, and the whole thing, as is the case with a lot of this stuff, they were told it was a practice exercise and they weren't doing this stuff for real. I'm not nailing my colours to the mast on it, I don't know. But that was one of the theories, and actually there's not much, to my mind, to my knowledge, there's not that much research of that particular event come out since then, or at least I haven't gone searching for it. I guess I was looking into that stuff. In fact, I know I was looking into it when I was back in Korea and I had my journalist job, and I was probably putting the finishing touches to this pamphlet. That would be 2008 and 9. So we had that, and I already mentioned the fact that I was on the climate change bandwagon for a while, and then I fell out of it because of looking at funding, looking for studying this whole idea of man-made carbon emissions. So I didn't get fired from that journalist job in Korea, but I kind of I mutually exempted myself from the position. I think I only lasted 3 or 4 months, but yeah, so that was going on at that time, and that would be probably the next conspiracy that I looked into. So these are building up now over the years. I would say between the ages of 16 and 30, it's slowly building up, but it's not explicit yet. And I guess it becomes explicit with two figures. Anybody who's been studying this stuff for a while will know, Alex Jones and David Icke. is it worth going into to? I mean, they're famous now. I mean, they're famous. In 2008 and 9, I was in Korea. I was studying video on conspiracy. I was looking into. Eventually, I think I only got in. I think I actually it kicked in, and for me this is quite weird and synchronistic. I was 33, which is a big Masonic number, and I was 33. So 2010, the end of 2010. So the other theories, like the London bombings, I'd only kind of touched the surface. And then you get Alex Jones and you get David Icke, and one comes in just a little bit earlier than the other. Temperamentally, I don't have much time for Alex Jones. Now and again, I'll see something where he's chatting and he's a bit more relaxed, and it's vaguely beneficial. And the other thing with the alternate research is that theories come in upon theories, so then you get flat Earth, and then people start arguing about one theory over another. This is the problem with effectively, it's the problem of the mainstream, because once you opt out, you then have a bunch of competing theories, and people get very possessive about that. And I have certain criticisms, even with people I think are brilliant scholars, alternate scholars and stuff, because they don't it's not really in their remit to kind of attack a new theory. It might be best not to talk about it if they're not interested in it. But this is the problem once you kind of drop out the mainstream, is you get a kind of this sense of competition, which I'm not too keen on, and maybe it's one reason why I've kind of kept away from commenting for this time, because I was just trying to find my feet. And I didn't really. If the mainstream is howling, then howling and shouting people down in the alternate sphere doesn't seem to me to be the best way to do things. I can understand people getting passionate about what they feel, but I mean, it's not even a warning, because I don't see myself as an authority on any of this stuff. But that's what I'm seeing over the last decade or so. I mean, it doesn't help my sympathies with them, for God's sake. I mean, people shout you down anyway because you vaguely got some freedom of thought about you. So I can sympathize as well. Okay, so let me just get into that initial push through a little bit more. So Alex Jones was doing a breakdown of Barack Obama. We just had Obama come in for a couple of years, I think. He'd been in 2-3 years when I was accessing Alex Jones's work. So he was doing a whole critique on Obama at that time, and the Clintons, and a bunch of other people. And then because David Icke was on his show, I would say that would be how I was introduced to David Icke. David Icke was also interviewed by another bunch of people that aren't very, well, at least on my radar, they're not as popular anymore. Project Camelot, who gave David Icke time, like a long interview where he could actually discuss his ideas properly. And that was very useful for me, because obviously we'd known that he'd been ridiculed in the 80s or whatever. I had actually seen that show on Wogan when I was a kid, but I'd only be, what would I be, 11 or 12, so you just ridicule everybody else, I guess, or you just stay stum about it. That was a really tough time, I imagine, the 80s, for that kind of stuff. Okay, I'll kind of put my position on David Icke, because I actually have very complex feelings about that. The thing is as you progress in these theories, you can become quite resentful and aloof, and you'll say, yes, but he's controlled opposition, or he's controlled opposition, and da-da-da. And unless you've got solid evidence for that somebody is, I would say you literally need to see that this person has funding from some dubious area, then I'm kind of open to a lot of things, and I don't rush to judgment. A lot of people say, Alex Jones is controlled opposition or something. I think a lot of this stuff, to be honest, is just just people's tastes. They have proclivities. They want to talk about certain topics, and they're not really interested in others. Actually, for a newer take on Alex Jones, you might want to watch the Joe Rogan video with Eddie Bravo from a couple of years ago, maybe not even that, maybe last year. That's interesting because you've got Alex Jones with somebody who will entertain the flat earth, you've got somebody who won't. You've got like three people in the room that cover a lot of topics in the way that they view the world. So I like that. Often when somebody's confined to their own show, they tend to be too dictatorial about what they want to cover. So it's always good to have with this channel, I'd like to have some conversations build up between people eventually, and so that they can throw up new ideas and new takes on vaguely established theories. I still read a lot actually in the non-alternate research realm. The one thing that I had with me with the Blake was that I could augment that with a lot of esoteric material that was being put onto the internet in the last decade. So that was in my daily routine of reading. That was the way that I research things. Like I said, I'm not really keen on that kind of tenor of conversation, of the kind of panic, we've got to do something thing. But maybe it's justified to a certain degree. I can't watch Alex Jones from one week to the next. It would be just as panicky on the opposite side as the regular news channels. But I mean, useful if you're into that kind of stuff. I'm assuming that most people know him by now. I mean, I don't know. I've looked at this stuff for a while. David Icke. The other thing with everybody, a lot of people in alternate research and conspiracy and talking about a conspiracy or the conspiracy, they tend not to name check other writers too much, and that's probably a good thing. But I'm just name checking certain people from a growth level, personal level. David Icke, complex. Because I can go with some of the crazier things, and some of the other things I don't agree with. For example, David Icke in one of his books says that Yeats is a bad person, or that Eliphas Levi was a Satanist. Eliphas Levi was a scholar of the tarot. I haven't found any evidence to suggest that he was a Satanist. A lot of tarot people are into magic and they're into alternate belief systems, yeah. But I would need to see evidence for that. So I think he's a little bit dogmatic with some of the stuff. I would need a little bit more proof that Yeats was. I mean, people have said, yeah, there is a section of Irish society which will just never confront the Anglo-Irish nature of Yeats's upbringing, and he's just from a family of the oppressor, and they tend to be Irish Catholic, working class, and they may have the same views on James Joyce as well. Yeah, so there's some difference of agreement there. Why do I prescribe to a proto-reptilian theory? Well, I look at it through mythology. So when I read that theory, and I still think the best book that Icke's written is called The Biggest Secret. And the problem, this is the problem I have with him, and the same thing with Alex Jones, is a repetition of material seems to come up far too much. And I guess when you're on that level of conspiracy, you deem that worthy because you essentially unconsciously see yourself as a gatekeeper into that world, and you want new people to come to your material, so you're constantly making videos about revelations that you had in the 90s and all the rest of it, and it's all laudable stuff, but just from a creative angle, I mean, I've grown out of that after 10 years or whatever. I don't watch David Icke videos or anything. very rarely. I found myself watching um, the handful of videos that he did with Brian Rose, mentioned in my lockdown video, I think, just because the situation was so odd that you kind of go back to some what's Icke's take on this kind of thing. But I don't and God bless him. I mean, the guy's writing tons of stuff and he's still producing books, and that's all to the good, I think. So I have a lot of problems with him. He doesn't have really a cosmology. It'd be nice to think that we're all one and we're seeing things through a different perspective. I can understand that. For me, there's the dualistic world and the Unitarian world, the unifying form, and it could even be some point in the future we might have some form of benign global government, but we're not spiritually there yet. I mean, we're way down that line. Do you know what I mean? I think nationalism and bringing our own economies back into order um, is the best thing. Um, and I wouldn't be pro any form of global government for the foreseeable future. Um, so, yeah, he has a very metaphysical angle on it. The interesting thing is this notion, he calls them the jinn, reptilians. There's lots of names for these people, archons. The good thing about David Icke is he can grab hold of a lot of bits of popular culture and throw it in your face under a theory, and you can go through that and say, wow, Monsters Inc., that's interesting. Or some movies, They Live is like become massively popular now, right? They Live is a great John Carpenter movie. I always loved John Carpenter, but obviously you pay more attention to these things if somebody gives you a very new take on it. But They Live, if you're like, it's a cool. John Carpenter always reminds me of Edgar Allan Poe. He's got that kind of supernatural horror element to him. I mean, I wouldn't recommend all his movies. If you've not seen The Fog, you got to go watch The Fog, right? Um, so yeah, I love all that stuff. So I like that about him. That's the good thing about being alive in some sense, is that there are elements of popular culture that are cool. I'm not going to keep myself aloof from them just because I'm a poet and a writer, as if that's like in another realm. I think there are things you can take from popular culture if you want. I don't see what I'm doing as a popular activity for a reader, but I do it because I love doing it. So anyway, that's by the by. I mean, it's pretty obvious that movies can be interesting if you've got a good mind behind them. Um, okay, let's do the reptilian angle. Gnosticism assumes that there are archons, right? I don't prescribe to most forms of Gnosticism, okay? I think that the canonical Bible is fine for most purposes. And then read your way through the Nag Hammadi scriptures very carefully. I don't like Manichaeanism. It's too strong for me. I think that when we talk about Gnosticism, we have an image of this very strict school, like in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that there are reasons to have very strict schools. But this was just general culture. If you read somebody like somebody I've been reading recently, Zoe Oldenburg, right? The massacre at Montségur. Okay, this is just European culture, right? The delineation of what a Christian was has only been solidified as the Catholic tradition of the Catholic Church has gone along and split off into all these other things. It was much more permeated by Gnostic thought, in the early centuries. And so that's, if I'm going to get into Gnosticism and talk about things like archons, then I guess that would be the milieu that I would be referring to. Um, I don't necessarily have any, obviously I don't have any problems with like strict orders of it, mystery schools, all of that kind of thing, because you do need to be incredibly strict with your personal behavior, like diet, things like that. We're totally degraded from a 21st century perspective, although a lot of that stuff is coming back as well, and I'll deal with that in another video. So archons, I take them as existing. I would love to. My real goal for the next decade is to start reading in ancient Greek and start reading in Latin without having to refer to translations, without having to deal with scholars, because not that some of them don't do a good job, but I want to see with a really investigative eye what's in that domain. We know that 90% of even stuff that comes from Latin into English, there's only 10% is transferred over in translation. There's a bunch of stuff in Latin from the ancient world, the Roman Empire. We don't have any access to it whatsoever. So, yeah, what's going on there? Are there archons in the Latin language? Are there people discussing forms of power and forms of social control? Back then, do you have to rely on Aristotle and Plato and Iamblichus to give us that? I mean, there's some good stuff in there, maybe, but do the work. I'm going to try and do that. I really, even if it's just to be a reader of Latin, I think that would be a useful thing to do. Mythologically speaking, the ancient world was in touch with that world. So it makes sense to read ancient Greek and Latin, even if it's just for that purpose. The reason I would agree on a supernatural level with the archon stroke reptilian angle is just through mythology. Identities in characterization of gods in the ancient world are very permeable. The gods are cruel. Now, why are they cruel? Because they're trying to get into the human realm, right? If we have archons in our modern society, they've done the same kind of job on us. Is that reason enough to shun all mythology? No. Or all gods? No. No. Become massively conscious of the line of those gods and the stories of those gods. As the spiritual world moves away from human perception, the gods then have to create extreme forms of behavior in order to be acknowledged by the human level. Be aware of that, okay? In their origins, when humans had that form of perception, you would not have that overridingly sense of a cruel god. That's a tricky topic, and you also need to connect it up with fairy lore and Irish folklore and all of the great folklores of the world. These are interconnecting lines of, let's say, metaphysical attitudes to life. So you don't do what the Dadaists did, which is basically say we're having an ultra-modern school of creativity here, we're going to shun the gods. No, I think that's a mistake. I think what you do is you learn mythology well, and then you apply it to your own time, and you choose the right gods. See, the ancients knew which gods to choose. You've got to choose the right one. And you've got to know what the characterizations were. Again, another reasons why you should probably learn those two ancient languages. And if I could get even a bare bones sense of Sanskrit, I'd probably try to do that as well, if I've got enough time. So I look at reptilian jinn figures within a whole context of mythology, a whole panoply of gods and goddesses, and they are the most negative entities, I would guess. So I think you have to kind of put these things in a context. If you study mythology enough to see that our modern world is entirely informed by those same gods and goddesses, or it has that potential, then the reptilian idea will not faze you too much. If you've read the Quran and you've read about the jinn in the Quran, it won't faze you. A lot of this stuff doesn't faze me. I would assume that cloning exists. The other thing that De Quincey talked about in that quote, which interests me, is that the awareness that he had at that time was that these were dead people who took bodies, which is interesting. Icke frames it in a very different way, I think. So they're basically disincarnate entities that take over bodies. They're immortal. And they're actually, if we study them, they're a template for us. This is what we do. They do it to a negative purpose. We don't. But the only problem with us is that we don't know we do it. So we are disenfranchised from the whole spiritual deal because we don't know um, the way that process occurs and what our power is. I mean, just at this point, given we're talking about conspiracy, I think all of this is to the good in the long term. You get the naysayers and all that. It's a form of information that's dying. It's in its death throes. So it's going to come up with all kinds of garbage to throw at you, to phase you, to put you in a box. So, and I don't care if I die or not. I really don't. I never have, to be honest. I'm a bit worried about madness. I want to make sense to myself and to the people around me. But death doesn't phase me, and I think I mentioned that in another um, video. Um, there are only certain ways that you could sacrifice yourself. We get the suiciding thing going on all the time, but and nobody would sensibly do that. I don't think if they're an intelligent person, regardless of what the Catholic Church says on the notion of suicide. Um, so we're in a position here with the reptilian angle to look at it through the lens of mythology and look at it through the lens of metaphysics, neither of which you're ever going to learn in school. And that's possibly why I would recommend somebody like Robert Duncan. The next video I'm going to make either today or in the next week is going to be on bardism, or the bard in our British cultural tradition and in our European tradition. I would say the bard is really the antithesis of the archon or the reptile figure. Also with this, the nomenclature of reptilian, it's a very tricky one too, right? Because, anyone who knows the Bible knows that the snake is used, and we have the dragon as well in Asian life. Be careful about the way these symbols are used. Don't go to the opposite extreme and assume that they're all negative. There are positive readings of Genesis, for example. Is it a coincidence that in a lot of shamanic experience, snakes are the first entity that you're going to confront, right? There's a great video out there. If I can find if there's a link for that video, I'll try and put it in the description. There's a wonderful series, I think it's a series of documentaries or one long documentary on shamanic experience, particularly as it relates to ayahuasca. And everybody talks about snakes, okay? And these snakes are healing snakes. They're all about shadow work. They're all about confronting your fears. Kundalini is a snake, right? Is it bad? No. But it does mean that if you're a jinn, if you really are one of these sham men, then you can use that symbology for your own purposes. If the symbol of the snake and of the Kundalini initially was acknowledged communally and in a wide sense through society, if you are going to control that society, you have to take on that image, right? Just as there is a God. So if you're the translator of the Bible, you want to give the impression that that God is evil, right? So you've taken down the true divinity of the thing itself. So this is the process all the time, is that human nature, human spirit throws out symbology. It throws out symbols, gods and goddesses. And the only way to take them down is to re-imbue yourself with that image over time. That is really the control, I would say, in essence. In the same way, you're not going to take down someone who's saying the truth now by setting yourself up in opposition. It's like the old gangster metaphor. Make friends. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer is the gangster thing, right? But in the same way, if you're a negative entity, or if you're a human with a treasonous approach to other human life, then you're going to have to want to take on the image of the person speaking truth to some degree. And I would say that is basically the history of the Catholic Church. How far I want to get into sacrifice, and I'm going to use the P word in this video because I don't know what the algorithm is doing. I'll get into that in another video. What I will mention now is Rudolf Steiner's The Occult, was it The Occult Use of Blood, or The Occult Symbology of Blood, or something? And I would definitely recommend reading Steiner on some of this stuff. Yeah, so my take on David Icke, I hope, is a highly nuanced one. Certain people have imbued this figure of reptile or reptilian over the last 10 years particularly. I mean, he came up with that idea in the early 2000s. It really only got widely discussed in the last decade, I would venture to say, and possibly only very, very recently for the newbies. There's a certain amount of takeover with the alien stuff, and they're saying these people are aliens and they're not from this world. I don't know. I don't have a theory about that. There's a lot of stuff that I've considered, though, about are these sham... should I keep using this sham men? Because it always gets confused with shaman, and I'm not... I don't want to give you the wrong impression. Let's just call them archons for now. So are these archons from Earth? Don't know. I think maybe they're not. Are they aliens? There's a problem here because, you know, they're also controlling our sense of space. So our sense of outer space and our sense of the planets and the solar system. I would suggest it depends on your cosmology. Now, I've looked into flat Earth more recently, and it's something that I have a lot of time for. That would be where I differ from some of the people even who are talking about these questions. Do I put all my eggs in one basket? No. Do I agree with some of the 2 or 3 of the main proponents, the people who've really thrown this stuff onto the internet for people to consume widely? No, there are some differences. The flat earth theory comes with its own cosmology. In the main 2 or 3 people, I have questions with that cosmology. There's lots of people talking about cosmology. That's why it's in my description for my channel. I like the word cosmology better than just overtly saying flat earth, not because I don't want to discuss flat earth, but because I'm interested in the whole package. So I want to talk about the whole package and then the theory of flat earth within it. Do you know what I mean? I think that would be good. And again, that's for other videos. But for this video, beings from outer space. Did you notice in the Charles Olson video I talked, Charles Olson had that element, that image of Tartarus, right? The Greek hell. I didn't go into it in that video because I was focused on other things, but that's interesting. I did mention flat earth though. That's interesting. 2 things come out of that on reflection. Tartarus is not just under, it's also outside. Does that mean outside any given firmament? Possibly. Could it be that if we have any space vehicles that people see, and we have loads of witnesses talking about aliens, that they are not from outer space? They are simply moving around on a flat plane of which we only have a certain view of. Don't know, but willing to speculate. So there's that angle. Reptilian proto-alien figure. Now these things have been spun over time. I'm much more interested in some form of interdimensional characters than the alien, because it's kind of like veganism, alienism. It's kind of like it's a little bit too prepackaged. Do you know what I mean? Even Jung wrote on flying saucers and stuff. I must actually read that because um, Jung was kind of interested in these topics as well. So I've not concluded on that. I think that will give you a general summary of the way that I view archons or reptilians. The only other thing to add is a great text which you should all read, and it is Ovid's Metamorphoses. Now frame the reptilian theory into Ovid's context. That would be a useful speculatory thing for you to do. I'm not giving you any answers on it. What is the book, The Metamorphoses? It's talking about gods changing into other gods, gods doing bad things and gods doing vaguely useful things, but they're basically in their own drama there, right? I think Ovid is vastly underread. Yeah, why not throw a new theory that's just come into our environment and try to apply it to ancient times? We know that Ovid already agreed with the notion of reincarnation, for example. I don't have the quote with me. I think it's in the Metamorphoses. I've read all of Ovid's texts in translation, but I haven't read them in the original. But definitely it's in the Lerb translation. If you go to archive.org and you pull up Metamorphosis Lerb translation, it's in one of the later books. I think there's 15 books. Where is my copy here? That's a new translation. The other problem, and it's been said in other videos by people, there are people actually speaking Latin, you know. Wonderful. Check out Scorpio Martianus, his channel. Luke Ranieri, he's a speaker of Latin. Don't know where it is, but read the thing anyway if you haven't read it. I mean, for people who've already read it, then fine. But I would say, like, why can't we apply notions of jinn, archon, reptilian into the notion of these gods and goddesses? Why not? I mean, my reading, the more and more you get into mythology, the more nuanced your views are. The more mixed feelings you have about certain gods. I mean, there could be a conspiracy angle you can apply to the ancient world too. If I say the main form of control is to take the image of a god and then transfer it, imbue it with other feelings about the world, that if that's like the essence of social control, could you not do that with Zeus? Could you create a second Zeus who decided to behave pretty much like the Old Testament God instead of something more benign and useful for humans? Don't know. It's something I was thinking about the other day because I was reading this book, The Suppliants, Aeschylus. Again, this is an old translation, probably not great. I may even read you my my marginalia on this one. So what's happening in the Suppliants? You've got a bunch of women coming to another location in Greece, and they're coming from Egypt, and they are shit scared because they've been basically treated like vessels for giving birth. They're being raped en masse and kept together as a kind of form of producing new humans. If you had an archon angle to this, could you say those humans were being bred so that they could be incarnated by these disembodied archons? It's feasible. And they get to Greece and they're trying to stay away from these archons who were in Egypt at the time, ancient Egypt. Well, we know how dangerous ancient Egypt was, right? Because we've got the Bible. That's the other thing you've got to do. Compare mythologies with the Bible. As many sources as you can to get a rounded picture on your mythology. I read the Bible mythologically as well as religiously or in terms of just searching for divinity in the world and how it asks us to behave. There's lots of ways of reading the Bible. That's one of them. I would suggest from reading the supplements that notion could be true, that we have a second Zeus. So what you have is, or an alternate Zeus worshipped somewhere else. It's one of the two, combination. Zeus, for people who worship Zeus, they will do what Zeus asked them to do. And if there is a Zeus that is benign, then you have a good society. If you replace the image of Zeus with some figure that says, I want blood sacrifice and I want it now, please, right? Then you have a degradation of society. And that's pretty much what happened to ancient Greece. I think by the time you get to Aristotle and by the time you get to Aristotle and Plato, you're already outside of the zone. The zone for me, the visionary zone from that period is Homer. It's Homer and pre-Homer. It's a tiny portion of even the translated text that we have of our Western mythology, right? There may be other corollaries in Hindu mythology and Celtic mythology and all the rest of it, but essentially it's over. Plato, Aristotle are giving you the dregs of what happened before. If you really want the juice of Greek culture, Parmenides, Empedocles, the pre-Socratics, right? Socrates is the great figure in philosophy, but you're going to have to go back. The other indication, the Homeric hymns, right? That's another great text. If you can get it with the Greek en face, then do it and then study it. So those are my texts, but that's totally for another video. Like Iliad, primarily, although the Odyssey is good, you should read them all anyway, right? Iliad is, for me, is the big one. The Homeric hymns, Parmenides, Empedocles. Those are the big ones for me. When we get into the later periods, the truth isn't clear, and we have to kind of really use our intuition and critical reading to figure out what's going on. All of the Greek plays are essentially, to me, to do with a drama, a macrocosmic drama of social control. I mean, Oedipus, to me, is a controlled human who has been messed with by the gods in their most degraded aspects. The Greek plays always fill me with lots of different feelings. But anyway, I'm getting off topic. Read everything, compare mythologies, don't leave the archon out of them. Read the pseudepigrapha of the Bible if you want to get a more rounded sense of the way that the Bible and ancient mythology intertwine. So that's a little footnote to what I was already saying about Icke's version of supernatural social control. We have problems because we use different words all the time. We've got supernatural, we've got mythological, we've got a bunch of terms here. And poets who can't take in all of the aspects of the way that clairvoyance can happen, the way that vision experience can happen, the way that healing plants can affect our bodily faculties and the mind. We've got to be able to tune into all of them. The ancient Egyptians, at least in Shrola de Lubitsch, say that man has hundreds of senses, okay? So that's the central tenet of Blake. We're down to the 5, right? What is junk DNA? This kind of stuff. So if you want to expand your consciousness and study and encourage visionary experience in yourself, mythology and the supernatural have to be in your remit as a writer. I was reading Walt Whitman the other day, and I noticed one thing, that And when you read people over time, you see their weaknesses and their strengths. I love Walt Whitman, but actually he's very much in the human realm. He's not Yeats, right? He's not Blake. I think he's very freeing, and I'll go into this in another video, in terms of this sense of felicity, this sense of outreach to other people, of oneness, of the Unitarian sense of we're all in it together kind of thing, in a critical way. Not, the thing is not to be all in it together in a blind, ignorant way, a la the Soviet Union. So I'm always suspicious, as a writer, especially with all the recent events. We're all in it together. No thanks, I'm okay. You get on with what you want to do if you want to destroy yourself, but so there's that. But there is an overarching unity and a felicity that you should encourage in yourself, so that you should be able to shoot the shit with anybody, regardless of their opinions. And then you get on with your own work. But then also, certain self-protection, all the usual things that you have to encourage in yourself on a behavioral level. Yes, so that's really my take on the Ickean worldview. Now, the other problems I have with Icke is that because of his generation, and even though he's a self-confessed metaphysician and researcher, is there another thing I need to mention? The African shaman. You should study that anyway. It's really interesting. I think that's one of the best things. The African shaman, forget his name, that might go in the description as well. And Arizona Wilder on the P word and on sacrifice. Those are really good journalistic things that he brought out into the open, and I augmented them with other things. So, for example, Kathy O'Brien, things like that. I think actually between 2010 and 15, that was my area of study, and I was lucky. I was lucky in a sense because I was living abroad, and I didn't work. I got a good salary, and I didn't work too hard, so I had a lot of free time on my hands. I'm aware of the fact that a lot of people don't, like they work 40 hours minimum a week, often more. I was working, well, I worked different contracts, some I worked more, but generally speaking, I never worked more than 10 to 15 hours a week, so that left me with a lot of free time at that specific time, like 2010 to 15. So I looked at a lot of different things. The Project Camelot thing fell away, mainly because they were a duo. Anybody who's looked into this stuff will know already that there was some kind of falling out between Kerry Cassidy and Bill Ryan. A lot of that stuff was alien type information, which I found very interesting at the time, but I think it's been co-opted in a way, and I'm not accusing anybody because I don't know the situation. It comes down to the fact that I haven't really looked at that information anymore, and I don't think it's as popular these days as it was. But good luck to the people that are involved with it, because it's interesting. I don't know to what extent these things are true, but you have to, some points you have an immersion process in certain things. So that was part of my journey too. So I think that's, Credo Mutwa, sorry, is the African shaman, Zulu shaman. I heard that he died recently. But if you're interested in this jinn concept, then look into it. It's funny with that area of research. That's often, it's the other way around with a lot of people. They will get into David Icke and all the health, the way that health has been controlled and all these, AI and all of this, and they'll grab hold of that and they'll see the kind of lower end of the scale. I always went for the more supernatural and spiritual side of Icke, and I think it was because of reading Yeats and reading what does he call it, the instructors, and automatic writing and all of that stuff, the more occult side of Yeats, so that I could kind of just throw all these things into the same pot I mean, I know people who love studying conspiracy, but if I say I believe in archons, they'll be like, "Are you bloody kidding me?" So, whatever. I don't really get that worried about this stuff in terms of I've got to launch an argument to prove once and for all. Just study what you like to study and relax and talk about what you want to talk about. Um, so that was that. Icke came in early, and I said the main book would be the biggest secret, but he's still busy as ever. Other people on that journey, again, I'll just recap: Kathy O'Brien, Ted Gunderson, um, all the good stuff from, say, that was coming up in the mid noughties, um, particularly about child sacrifice, which is all coming to light now. Um, I'm interested to see how this year progresses, just on that view, because we're going to have some interesting thing happen. I think. What else? And also it's worth mentioning. I'll do a video on the chakras, but I do think I became convinced after studying a lot of this stuff that you see, oh Jesus, there's so much stuff to talk about. I went to India right at the end of the 90s, and that kind of started my journey on working abroad and living abroad in Asia for a long time. But what was I going to say? I had that side of wanting to know um, Asian philosophy and Asian spirituality, and again, it was a lot of naivety because I was young or whatever. But I noticed that these things over time have come up more and more, and I've not done a lot of reading in it up until recently. But after I got into, you know, forms of the occult, human sacrifice, I'd already read a few things on what is it called, the Aztecs as well. I basically came to the general opinion that obviously for me, the chakras are very important. That we'd had a shutdown in order to make this material world more manageable for the controllers, the powers that be. The main two that have gone are the root chakra, so that would be reproductive organs, and the is it the sixth one here, right? That's more to do with the way that health has progressed, so to shut down the third eye. So I think those two, obviously, I think there's basically damage been done to all of them, but those are the big two, right? I'll probably do some videos on the manipulation of sexuality as well, but because I'd had that background in studying, or at least being aware of this sense of what the chakras are, I've never been a meditator, by the way. I do meditation recently, but not at that time. It seemed to me that the shutdown of the shamanic aspect of life, which I'll get into in my Bardism video, involved those two chakras, and it involved replacing the beneficent aspects of what those chakras do with other forms. I'll get into that in another video. So that is why you've got the world the way it is, because of that basic energetic shutdown. For a long time, you get caught up in politics and you think, well, if we can stop them invading Iraq, then that will solve everything. Or if we can stop such and such person doing that, then we can stop them. Then the world will be a better place and we'll all come by our harmony everywhere and all of that. But as you study these things more and more, you realize that it's a basic energetic principle, right? It's not it's good to kind of protest to some degree certain issues, but really it's an energetic problem. There are dimensions, they do exist. In the myths, they talk about 7 dimensions, sometimes 9, I can't remember. The Nordic system is different to the Celtic system, and on and on and on. It's a world phenomena, the way that people talked about the dimensions. And if you study mythology, then you will discover all kinds of interesting things. And because I believe in the law of synchronicity, you'll discover what you need to discover for yourself personally, whether you deem yourself a poet, writer, or whatever you do. So because your soul will inevitably be attracted to certain traditions. And if we do have any kind of unity in terms of study, then that's the unity we have. We have synchronism. What is it? Syncretistic thinking, so that we can now compare and contrast different traditions of mythology. I mean, just consider that for a second. Before the 19th century, we didn't have any. We didn't have any. Schopenhauer was one of the first people to say, you've got to read the Upanishads. And in fact, you don't know, like I say, you don't know why you're studying these things at the time, but yeah, I studied Schopenhauer at university, and I did my dissertation on Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was probably the first continental philosopher to talk about the Upanishads, a great Latin translation that he'd found, and he thought was the most important book, and he would read it every morning and every evening or something. He has a little anecdote about how he incorporates that into his philosophy. So in many ways you could say Schopenhauer is a Buddhist philosopher. I didn't claim that in my dissertation. I can't remember. My dissertation was on genius and madness, which is possibly another topic for a video, the connections between genius and madness. Anyway, these things have been percolating through these mythologies, and it's time for us to compare and contrast and produce more, even if you're just writing prose books. I've always found that regardless of what I was studying, there's always somebody ferreting around in the background writing a lot of books on mythology. It just seems to be the way we function, even in Britain. Now, I think there's been a resurgence recently. I mean, I would recommend Lewis Spence. He was a Scottish journalist when they had such things as real journalists. And he did a lot on mythology. I've got most of his books, in fact. They're very good. And Colin Wilson, of course. But Colin Wilson doesn't cover mythology as well. Another good mythographer, as he likes to be called, is Roberto Colasso, who I've been reading recently. Just great authorities on mythology, and they can really go into depth on all of that stuff. So anyway, was that another tangent? Anyway, that was that. I will give you, let's have a look at some of the books, just to give you snippets of the way that, because I was reading a lot of, I was studying conspiracy, but I was also studying a lot of literature. I'm going to have problems with the word literature, but I'll explain that. But anyway, through poets and writers that I'd known, as I was trying to expand my knowledge of poetry, conspiracy was kind of intersecting that study, so that I found a lot of overlap. And it's some, in fact, if I have any value to people, it could be that you can, in other researchers, it's not as, they don't go into the literary side of it too much. I think that's something I can hopefully show effectively. So for example, I didn't pull out my copy of the book Ezra Pound Speaking, but I have a bunch of other things here, and I'm going to talk about that given that we're on the topic of conspiracy. I mean, this is the other problem, as you know, if you're studying, is that conspiracy is broad brush. It's really, if you're going to look at it from a spiritual perspective, it's really just new ideas. It's just new ideas. That's all it is. And we're getting panicky because we're going through this transference from one realm of information traversal into another one which is much wider. And so we're going to have the panic for, I would say, somewhere between 20 to 30 years of this word conspiracy. It's just new ideas. Take it however you want to take it, you know, and of course, don't take it if you don't want. My assumption being that most baby boomers won't take it. And everywhere else it's an open playing field. But I want to talk about how generations even inhabit forms of information as well. Okay, so when I got into Icke, I also got into Eustace Mullins, and actually my studying Ezra Pound came at a similar time, and that's the big one. Came at the same time as reading Pound and Mullins, kind of intertwined. So I came to Pound to a very different direction, and because I was in Korea, I was getting PDFs from the internet. In Korea, as is different to anywhere in the Western world, people don't have a lot of money. Students don't have a lot of money. They have oftentimes a lot less money than people in the West do, even though it's debt money anyway. But what they do is they print. They have a very active printing service, printing shops for a lot of people. I don't know whether they still exist now. I don't know how students are accessing information, but I would say somewhere between the years of 2010 and 2015, what was happening was I was basically making books. This is Eustace Mullins' biography of Ezra Pound. I've made it. It was just printed from a PDF. I printed it out, and you could get these things for the price of the book in the West, probably. Obviously that wouldn't occur because these books are rare. You couldn't always buy them in the West for a decent price. So instead, I just made a whole bunch of these books, loads of them. I probably got maybe 50 to, I don't know, at least 50 books just of this kind. A lot of them don't have snazzy covers, anything. They're just, I'll show you an example. This is the book I'm going to use in another video, right? That's just my penned in presentation of the book. It's just printed, and it would cost you 7 or 8 quid. So my vision, my view of Ezra Pound, and this is, and again for another video, is very different, and it includes conspiracy, and it includes that angle on things. In fact, you could argue that in modern terms, Ezra Pound is kind of one of the great fathers of conspiracy theory, because he's talking about the Federal Reserve in the 1920s and 30s. The Federal Reserve in America had only existed since 1913. So within a couple of decades of its founding, Pound has already cottoned onto it and is talking about it and how it creates money out of nowhere. This is not, it was, I mean, back in 2010 it was a conspiracy. Now I don't think it is. It's just general knowledge. I mean, I think there's been so many videos about Pound in this context now that it doesn't mean that I need to talk about it that much, because it's already out there. So, and I won't go on about it here because this is not a video on Ezra Pound. This is a quote I often come back to. Selected prose 1909 to 1965. Not one of Pound's most well-known books. In fact, because I was in Korea, I was also lucky. I was able to get everything the guy published, not the things that popular publishers want you to read of Ezra Pound. I think, to my knowledge, I have everything. Maybe I'm missing a couple of the economic pamphlets, or I only read them online. But apart from that, I think I've got every book. I've read everything. The only thing I've not read is The Confucian translations, I'm not a massive fan of Confucius. And those are in the mainstream publishing. So there's probably I'm not being arrogant going on about how much I've read or anything. I'm just trying to explain, and this will come into a lot of the other videos, is that there is the sanctioned version of the poet, and then there is all the other stuff. If you look at P.B. Shelley, it's exactly the same, okay? We have a sanctioned version of that poet, and we have a official version for study, okay? This is a problem with the human mind, okay? The way the academy will grab hold of a poet. I'm of the opposite point of view, the saturation job, which I've already used as an expression, which is if you like something, try and get everything. Try and read everything that person wrote. If you loved them, I mean. Obviously, we all have priorities in our study, but I'd say go for it, like, if you want to learn about that person's mindset. I always use this quote, and I used it in my Fiend articles. I think this is the forward to Selected Prose. This is Pound a year before he dies in Venice. To tread delicately amid the scrapings from the cracker barrel is no easy job, and Mr. Cookson, the editor of this volume, has made the best of it. The volume would be more presentable had it been possible to remove 80% of the sentences beginning with the pronoun I, and more especially those with we. The substitution of I by a comprehensive claim in which we or one is used to indicate a general law may be a pretentious attempt to expand a merely personal view into a universal law. I think he's being a bit hard on himself because he's had a good 15-year period where his ideas have not circulated. The idea of getting the economic control theory into the public arena has failed. And so he's blaming himself for the way that he's constructed his writing. In sentences referring to groups or races, they should be used with great care. And then the most important thing, and the reason that I'm reading this, re-usury. I talked about it at my channel, my WordPress channel, site, The Fiend. Re-usury. I was out of focus, taking a symptom for a cause. The cause is avarice. And this is kind of my totemic quote that I always use. He's talking about a spiritual problem. Avarice, greed. It's in the Bible. Usury is in the Bible as well, right? That's the central problem. Money lending, he understood what was going on with the Federal Reserve. He'd kind of done an interesting take on it. The speeches you have to either listen to online or read before you start shouting about him being a Jew hater or something. Read in a nuanced way. I've already said, take his use of the word kike, take it for what it is. It's just a slur. I don't approve of it. I don't have any hatred towards Jewish people. Take that slur and understand that he's just using it in his own context because he had proclivities toward that form of judgment of a race. But don't use his use of that word to negate the rest of what he's saying in the speeches. It's very important to have a nuanced view on the speeches. Nobody studying in the mainstream academy now will ever touch the speeches for that one reason, that he's being dismissive of a race of people, okay? What you need to do is read with nuance and read between the lines. He's naming names. He's talking about the Federal Reserve. He's talking about the economic control. He's saying that the Second World War and the First World War were created by forms of economic power to get what they want. And if we're really going to go for the dystopian angle with the conspiracy theory, two big events. 9/11 for me was one. Possibly this new thing. The two is really the end of the Second World War and 9/11. When I study recent history, those are the two big ones. Society has changed irrevocably after the Second World War. He's writing this in 72, right? So he's basically like Charles Olson. He's an intelligent person now in a realm of stupidity in the mass, right? And now we have, at least for a good 30, 40-year period, no real knowledge in the public arena. I would be more positive now because of the internet. I'd say that these things are flourishing again to a degree, but it took us a while, right? That's why if I appeal to parents or my parents' generation on any important topic, like what is inflation, what is money lending, how do the banks get their power and keep their power? Can you tell me? Are there powers that be beyond the government that wish us harm? There's nothing there that they can talk about in the main, most of them, not all of them. There's some really good ones, as usual. And that's because there's basically a shutdown of information, I believe. That although you can take the long view of the conspiratorial angle, and I've already talked about the ancient world, and you could have had conspiracies all the way through, absolutely possible. I would talk about that in another video. I still think there's a shutdown somehow. At the end of the Second World War, there's definitely a turning point there. You get the National Health Services coming up in Britain. That's a big problem, I would say, at least in the main. You get a lot of, at least in Britain, you get a lot of destruction. You get a lot of architectural renewal in town centres, which makes Britain uglier, essentially. And I always connect architecture with spiritual matters as well, because they affect you. If you live in a shitty place, you feel shitty, and there's a reason for that. Do you know what I mean? There are reasons. So he's a little bit out of his element now when he gets into the 1970s. Ezra Pound, great man on the economics of the conspiracy, and Eustace Mullins, A Writ for Martyrs, is there. He's all over the internet now. I don't want to spend too much time on him. This is a great book. You can probably get all these books in PDF now and read them on an e-reader. Secrets of the Federal Reserve is the book that he wrote. He was commissioned to write that book because of Ezra Pound. Right? So you need to, if you're not absorbed the speeches and taken a nuanced view and not just knee-jerked and looked at a word and said, oh, he's a racist, I can't do with this information. I think that's just a good emblem for anything. If you feel like a knee-jerk reaction to something, anything, then think again or mull it over. Because I think a lot of the best information, it's like the best music. Like you don't always initially go, oh, wonderful, I'm going to listen to this forever now. It's like, I think this is an energetic principle as well. It's not always, but often it's like that short, sharp shock is like, ooh, I don't know what I'm going to do with that. I talked about that in the same way with, Robert Duncan reading Ezra Pound or me reading certain things in the past. Like you're a bit kind of taken aback. Like it seems a bit too, it's what Yeats calls the fascination of what's difficult. In the long term, you're fascinated and you lean in, but in the short term you're kind of like, that looks like total garbage, right? It's very important to get that going and thinking about that more. So anyway, that's the economic angle of the conspiracy and studying good old Ezra. I would suggest there's probably no good way of studying Ezra within normal forms of education. I don't agree with all of what he says in his prose, but I think he's essentially the giant of the 20th century in terms of poetry, and you would be foolish to ignore him entirely. Interestingly, he rejected Joyce's Finnegan's Wake as decadence, and so did Charles Olson. I don't agree with that. In fact, if you want the anecdote, I'll tell you. I think Pound was sponsoring Joyce in helping him out with his writing and finding ways for him to get portions of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man published. And I think he helped him with Ulysses. But then later on, Joyce finished Finnegan's Wake and sent him a copy, and Pound just rifled through it and couldn't make any sense of it, and so he wrote Decadence on the cover and sent it back to Joyce. That's the famous anecdote about that. I think it happened. I wouldn't go that route. I think there's something going on there with Finnegan's Wake, which is fascinating. But anyway, explicitly, at least explicitly, Ezra Pound had discovered certain seeds of the conspiracy. And he hadn't got hold of the spiritual element of the thing. He'd gotten onto the economic control of the thing. In some ways, De Quincey's quote is more penetrating than much of what Pound has to say. But if you take that economic control as a concrete problem, yeah, Pound is in that realm of thinking about the world. Okay, I'm getting on for quite a while now, so I'm not wanting to go too much more into the conspiracy angle. The health issue is a problem. I read a lot into Rudolf Steiner. I read a lot into Manly P. Hall and other more esoteric writers. I'll get into that in other videos when I talk about the NHS and health. But I just wanted to do a breakdown of the way that I started thinking conspiratorially. And it's actually not something that's been on my radar for the past few years, because I've been more interested in politics. Politics is changing rapidly, and I think it's very interesting, and I've probably lost a few friends because of my political views. I am more interested in the way that, as I say, people screaming out of the media, screaming about this, that and the other, far-right extremists, this, that and the other. What's actually happening is that the cultural viewpoint, as I mentioned in other videos, is just shifting. It may seem that it's shifting to the right, but what's actually happening is, as the old paradigm is shifting more and more to the left, the new paradigm is adjusting that to the right. Now, you can have all kinds of opinions on conservatism, but that's essentially what's happening. It's just an adjustment because of certain things not being catered for in the television newspaper realm anymore. You get the odd newspaper article that's interesting, but essentially the window is shifting too far to the left, and the internet is going, no, we're staying where we were. So it can seem catastrophic, and it can seem positive depending on what information you're looking at. So that's the way I look at that problem with the last few years, and it really is going insane. I mean, if you're my age and you look at the way the media behaved from 97, 98, 99 to now, I mean, yes, we were all foolish then, possibly. But, the things that the media is suggesting now, I mean, the fact that we're wearing masks in supermarkets right now is because the media is kind of, they're not the observers of society anymore. They're basically dogmatically telling you, you've got to do this now, you little bastard. Do you understand me? So that role has changed. And the reason they're doing that is because they're going to lose. So they got to throw a few eggs at the wall. I think that's the way it's happening. But I just wanted to give you a general sense of my looking into different conspiracies. There's lots more. I've studied flat Earth. I'm willing to talk about it. I've looked into a lot of cosmology. lots of different things. Paul is dead, the Beatles thing. I was a big Beatles fan, so I could easily do a video on that if I want. If you're interested in PID, then look at Tina Foster. It's the best go-to source, but there's lots of them out there. They'll all interconnect. You'll find them after a while. Um, Lots of them. It's just human judgment. Have a look at something, study it, see if it raises any questions for you. It's human nature to be curious. It should be. I think we have a paradigm shift that's quite brutal, but I think maybe certain shifts are brutal. They kind of have to be brutal. The other thing I notice right now is nearly everyone I know, it's kind of like in The Hound of Heaven, which I read in my British and Irish poetry video. It's like God's kind of like going, you got to change shit now. It's getting a bit like that. A lot of people who are not in this way of thinking, which I've described, in the last hour and a half, they're having really tough shit happen to them. Like really bad things are happening to them. And I think it's part of that divine process. They're having problems in their relationships. People they love are having health problems. They're having issues generationally with people trying to get their opinion over in the right way without offending anybody and hurting feelings. So it's very polarizing, and I think it's good if you have a background in this stuff. If you want to throw all this information away, fine. I mean, there's loads of stuff out there already. I just wanted to give my view on that. I don't think there's anything else I want to talk about with that. What are the main books for this way of thinking? I would say anything by Eustace Mullins. That Selected Prose of Ezra Pound is good on the economic angle of the conspiracy. There's a bunch of other books that I'm going to do with. I think I'm going to make a list of just 10 most inspiring books that changed my life. I know that's a very kind of mainstream kind of way of doing something, but I think it might be good, like particularly like with esoteric books or books that aren't very well known, or even books of philosophy, because philosophy can be fun, but it's not always made fun in the way that we're educated. So maybe something like that as well. Anyway, I think that will round off everything for conspiracy. Yeah, I hope that was useful to you, and I'll keep on seeing you in the next ones. Bye.